my parents used to say that I would always say I wanted to be a writer from when I was quite a small child. And I've got no memory myself of saying it, but they said that I said it. I think maybe it just starts with the love of reading. You know, I think that I was a child who loved to read, and I lived in a very different media world. You know, I mean, in India when I was growing up, there was no television. You know, it didn't exist. We had radio and movies and books. You know, so books were a natural, very large part of my growing up. You know? And I think I was somebody who responded very strongly to that, entering the world of imagination, you know, somebody else's imagination. And I think when a small child says, I want to be a writer when I grow up, maybe what he means is, I love reading books, you know, and I want to do that thing that I love when other people do it. You know? So maybe that was it. There were a number of different kinds of books and stories that I can remember liking. First of all, I mean, I heard many of the most famous, let's say, Arabian Night stories or Eastern fables. In fact, I heard them really orally from my father, who would tell them to us as bedtime stories in his own versions of them, obviously. You know, he wouldn't read them, he would just simply tell us stories. So the first time I heard about, you know, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, or Sinbad the Sailor, or Aladdin, whatever, you know, was in these versions of my father. I think even before I knew that there was a book that they came from, you know, I just thought my father was a very good storyteller, these great stories to tell, you know. So there was that, and I mean, I think I've said a lot, but it's true, that to come from that background with this incredible storehouse of fantastic tales as your first literary inheritance, you know, that was important. I mean, you know, and I've carried those stories around with me, you know, all my life, I think, really. But children's stories, I mean, apart from that Eastern tradition, in terms of Western children's stories, some of them showed up and some of them didn't. You know, I mean, as it happens, Hans Christian Andersen did show up, or at least some of them, the famous stories, you know, in an anthology, and so I did read those as a child. And was particularly struck by, I mean, in my memory, the two that I remembered that really affected me were The Snow Queen and The Shadow, which is, you can see that even as a child I had an interest in the dark side, you know, because they're both frightening stories, one with a happy ending and one without one. But also there were much more banal children's books that showed up. I mean, there were a lot of English children's books about children at boarding school. You know, it's like Harry Potter without the magic, just school stories. And I remember reading a lot of those, and I suppose they had something to do with why I said yes when my father asked me if I wanted to go to an English boarding school. And it's because I'd read all these stories about English boarding schools. They seemed like great places, and then, of course, when I showed up there, they weren't at all like that. They were much more unpleasant. Alice in Wonderland, that showed up, that had a big effect on me. Still does, really. Yeah, so it was erratic. I mean, I remember there's an English children's writer called Arthur Ransom, who wrote books about these two families of children in the Lake District who had boats, little sailing boats to sail around on the lakes. And the thing that I remember thinking about reading those books was the incredible amount of personal freedom these children were given, you know, to go off by themselves all day on the water, you know, in a boat, and to make camp on an island in the middle of the water. I thought, why do their parents let them do that? You know, the idea that Indian parents would allow their children that much latitude, you know, to just go off and have their summer over there somewhere while the parents were busy doing their own thing, that seemed like a fantasy. I think certainly reading books from elsewhere, you know, is something I've always enjoyed, and I think it's one of the great gifts that literature gives us, is that it opens to us worlds which are not our world, you know, but which by reading these great books can feel to us as if they become our world. You know, I mean, I know nothing about Russia, really. You know, I mean, I've spent maybe 2 days of my life in Russia. And yet, because I've spent a lot more than 2 days of my life in Russian literature, you know, Pushkin, Bulgakov, Chekhov, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, I feel that I do know something about it. I understand something about Russia, you know, from that. I've never been to Japan, and yet I love Japanese literature. And I feel that through reading people like Tanizaki and so on, that I know something about how Japan works as a culture, you know. So, and it was the same for me when I first read Latin American literature. I had never been to Latin America, you know, but I felt that I had been through the books. And even America, you know, even North America. I mean, I had become a devotee of American literature, you know, Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, Malamud, Kurt Vonnegut, Thomas Pynchon, you know, long before I'd ever visited the United States. And so I've always felt that books have given me that, you know, they are like doors opening into another world, which by stepping through that door, it becomes your world. So I was very interested in language, but also in film, you know, and of course, advertising involves the use of both, you know, both forms. But I mean, that, you know, that's not really where I started writing. That's what I had to do to earn a living, you know. So because I had, after I left university and was living in London and trying to begin as a writer, you know, I had a slow beginning. There are writers who take off right away, you know, and that wasn't my case. So, you know, I graduated from Cambridge in 1968, and Midnight's Children came out in 1981. So there was a period of 12 and a half years, let's say, before I finally had, you know, got somewhere as a writer, did something worth doing as a writer. And during that time, I needed to earn some money. So advertising seemed to me that at least it was writing of a sort, you know, and maybe I could do that. And it turned out I could do that. And I think, but it turned out for me to be more to do with my interest in cinema than in writing. You know, that I was more attracted and interested in the making of television commercials. You know, and in fact, if I think back to those years, the moments that I remember with most satisfaction or interest, you know, are those moments of making little pieces of film. You know, and interestingly, I mean, I was essentially working in advertising as a means to an end. You know, I was working in it so that I could pay the bills while I wrote my novels. A lot of filmmakers in England in the 70s were doing the same thing. I mean, filmmakers who afterwards became a kind of golden generation of British filmmakers. You know, so there were people like Nicholas Roeg, you know, Hugh Hudson, Alan Parker, Ridley Scott, Tony Scott. You know, all these people making advertising commercials, you know, part-time as a way of, same thing, as a way of sort of earning a living, and while they were setting up movies over the course of a year or two, they would, to pay the bills, do a few commercials. You know? And I mean, I made hair care commercials with Nicholas Roeg. You know? And in my memory of those advertising years, I remember that aspect because I felt that here were other creative people, you know, very, very brilliant creative people, who, like me, were kind of biding their time, you know, trying to make their real life happen, you know, and that's what I felt. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it was a time when the cinema was extraordinarily creative, and I loved all of that. It was a time when the music industry was incredibly important in the lives of young people. You know, it was the time of, well, first of the great moment of the late '60s with, you know, with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan and you know, other more recherche groups like the Velvet Underground and the, you know, the Jefferson Airplane and so on, and after that punk and so on. But so I mean that was very interesting too. And I mean I, looking back on it, think that I could easily have been knocked this way or that way into trying to write for films or make films or trying to write. I mean I had friends who wrote music. I could have collaborated on songs, you know. But I think partly it's to do with having some form of solitude in your nature that you prefer to do it by yourself. You know, I mean, I discovered in the end that that's what was most pleasing to me, was just to sit in a room and do something. And when I had done whatever it is I was doing in that room, it was finished. That was it, the thing. Whereas, you know, a screenplay is only a step on the way to a film. And some people would argue it's not even the most important step. You know? And even a stage play is only a step on the way to an actual production. And I just thought I like to do it by myself, you know. And I think it's that. I mean, I was good at English, you know, I was good at writing. And so people tend to gravitate towards what they're good at. And I knew that I had a facility for writing. And so that became natural to think that I would do that. But it took me a very long time to find out how to do it. You know, I mean, one thing to want to be a writer, it's quite another thing to be a writer.
Looking back today, how do you reflect upon Midnight's Children? What status in your...
Well, I mean, you know, it was a book that changed my life. I mean, it was, you know, first of all, I remember when I finished it, which took me 5 years, I felt pretty sure that it was a good book. You know, I remember thinking, as far as I can tell, this is a good book. You know? But because my career had been completely obscure up to that point and not marked by any kind of success, I had really no confidence that anybody else would agree that it was a good book. And so there was a lot riding on it. I mean, I'm sure that if that book had not been well received, that it would have been very difficult for me to go on and write another one. You know, just because my confidence would not have been there. You know, I was really in need of some validation, let's say. You know, and of course the great pleasure of Midnight's Children is that it told me that I was in fact the writer that I hoped I could be. You know, and gave me the confidence to go on. You know, and now, I mean, the thing that I never in a million years expected was what was the phenomenon of that book, you know, and what it became. And so now, I mean, looking back, first of all, I'm very proud of it as a book. And I'm very proud of that young man who, you know, struggled for 5 years to find out how to do it, you know, without any guarantee that it would even be published, you know, let alone be successful, let alone become the thing that it's become. So the other thing is that if you're my kind of writer, if you're a writer of what is now called literary fiction, used just to be called literature, you know, you're writing books which you hope will endure. You know, I mean, that's a large part of the thing you think you're doing, is to write something that will last, that will sit on a bookshelf and will outlast the author. You know, and in the same way as that, as a reader, I read books by people from 100, 200, 300 years ago, with pleasure. You know, you hope that you're going to put a book on a shelf which will stay there, you know, and then another one beside it. You know, so well, it's not 100 years, but I mean, it is now, what, 33 years since Midnight's Children came out. And the fact that people still read it, the fact that people still find it has some meaning for them, you know, that young people, anybody under 34, you know, is basically younger than the book, you know, and the fact that young people still read it and find that it has something to say to them, you know, that's very satisfying, because that means that it's done the first generation leap, you know, it's managed to leap the boundary into the next generation. If it can do a couple more of those generation leaps, then it has a chance of lasting. You know, I mean, I won't be around to see it, but at least I've lived long enough to see it jump the first hurdle. You know, and that, I mean, there's great pleasure in that.
Another book you put on the shelf, as you say, is the Satanic Verses, and of course that is a book that changed your life.
In another direction, changed my life.
In another direction, and I mean, how do you look upon this book today?
Well, I think a number of things about it. First of all, I think that one of the things that's almost uncanny reading the book now is the way in which you come across lines in it that seem to have been written with the knowledge of what happened to the book, you know, but were in fact written before that happened. You know, so there's a character in the book who is told by somebody else that he's endangering himself by setting his word up against the word of God, you know, etc. And so there are all kinds of moments when the book seems to understand what happened to it in a way that's a little bit spooky, you know. I mean, what I do think is that the book was deliberately misdescribed. It wasn't misunderstood. It was deliberately misdescribed in order to mislead people so that they would become angry and rise up. You know, I mean, and that was a deliberate project to distort the book. What is good, I think, with the passage of time, is that project, I think, can now be seen to have failed. You know, that the book is now sitting there, and people read it and study it. You know, and they begin to see that the actual book, the words on the page, are somewhat different than what was said of the book at the time. One of the things, for instance, that nobody ever said about the Satanic Verses at the time of the Trouble was that it's quite funny, you know, but it is in parts quite funny, I think. And it was as if, because the attack on the book was so lacking in comedy, you know, because that wasn't funny, how could the book be funny? So somehow the characteristics of the attack on the book were perceived as being the characteristics of the book. So because the attack wasn't funny, the book wasn't funny. Because the attack was religious, the book must be about religion. You know? Because the attack was sort of incomprehensible and obscure, who could understand what they were upset about? The book must be incomprehensible and obscure, you know, and I think some of the damage that was done for a time was of that kind, that people were led to believe that the book was other than it was because of the nature of the attack against it. And I mean, that's what's good about time passing, you know, because now, as I say, I think the book has more or less, I don't think it'll ever completely be just a novel, you know, because of that history will attach itself to that book like a sort of footnote, at least, you know, but hopefully only as a footnote, because now people are just reading the book, you know, and it's finally able to have the ordinary life of the book, and you know, some people like it a lot, some people like it a little, some people don't like it much, some people hate it, and that's just what happens with books, you know, and I'm just pleased that it's finally able to be a novel instead of being all these other things, you know, that it was made out to be. Yeah, well, that's one of the things that I immediately thought when you talked about your daughter being 9 years old, because my son was 9 years old at that time. You know, at the time when the trouble really began, he had not yet reached his 10th birthday. He was about just 9.5, kind of. You know. And so I always felt that this didn't just happen to me; it also happened to him. You know, and there was this boy having to deal with the fact that every time he turned on the television, there were these mobs around the world wanting his father to be killed, which is a lot for a 9-year-old boy to face, you know. And suddenly there was a great intrusion of security, policemen, guns, you know, into our private life. And one of the things that I had to do in those years was his mother and I had to do was to try and help him deal with it. You know? And one of the things I did was to try and to treat him more like an adult than I should have, perhaps. But what I'd learned quickly was that if I was trying to explain things to him, if he heard them from me first, you know, if I said, this happened today, and obviously I would try and put the most positive spin on whatever I was telling him, but I would try and make sure that he heard the news from me, you know. And as long as he was doing that, it seemed he was able to deal with it. That when kids in the school playground would come up to him and saying, do you see what happened about your father? He would say, yes, I know about it. This is what happened and this is what it means. You know, and it would actually give him tools with which to deal with the problem. And the times when he would get very scared were times when I was somehow not able to reach him in order to tell him about something, and somebody would tell him something about what was happening to me that he didn't know. Then it would freak him out. You know, so part of what I did was to just try and help him through it, and the other way that I did that was to write a book for him. You know, and that became a very close bond between him and me, because he knew that I was writing the book for him, and he commented on the book as I was writing it, and he became very proud of it when it was written. And so, you know, that was an important book for us as a family, apart from for me as a writer. I was, for a long time, separated from my library, you know. I mean, because I was not living in my own house, I was, at least for the first few years. You know, after that I did have a house of my own and I was able to bring my things there. But for the first few years, I really didn't, you know. So I had to really specifically ask for certain books to be brought so that I could look at them, you know. And those were books of two kinds. On the one hand, I really, as a way of trying to say I'm still here and still functioning, I agreed with the newspaper in England to write book reviews. So then contemporary books, you know, would arrive. I remember, you know, Philip Roth's autobiographical text, The Facts, was one of the books that I reviewed, and things like that. So on the one hand, I was trying to stay in touch with new work, and by writing about it, to express my continued existence as a writer, you know. So that was one kind of thing, and the other was, well, I mean, I tried to read books which would help me think about the situation I was in, you know. So I found myself reading again a lot of the writers of the French Enlightenment, you know. So I found myself reading again Montesquieu and Voltaire and Diderot and so on, and philosophers, you know. I found myself reading John Stuart Mill on liberty, and, you know, all these classic texts, Milton's Areopagitica, you know, the famous body of texts which expresses what we've come to think of as the modern idea of free expression. And they were very helpful. And then I tried to, especially when I was starting to write fiction again, when I started to write what became Haroun in the Sea of Stories, I often, when I'm writing a novel, I tend to read like around the novel, you know. So I tend to read texts which have some relationship to what I'm thinking about. You know, so then I started reading again this world of Eastern myth and fable. You know, the Panchatantra animal fables, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata. You know, and even some less well-known things, like there's a wonderful adventure story, which is, I think, Farsi in origin, which is the Hamza Nama, which is the adventures of this Prince Hamza, you know, which are partly real-world adventures. You know, he fights wars and falls in love with girls and so on. And then there's fantastic elements to it, that he also fights dragons, and there's a point where he goes to fairyland and marries a princess and has a child by her, and then comes back to the real world. So anyway, so I read a lot of that stuff, because that was obviously useful as a way of thinking about the book I was writing, and so on. And then you know, then at a certain point it became easier for me to have my books, and then it was better. Mostly in those years, I was very touched and impressed by the degree of solidarity that there was, you know, mostly. I mean, there's, you know, nothing is ever 100%, you know, so there are always some people who fall short of what your expectation is. You know, there were some publishers in some countries who were not courageous. There were some writers from whom I would have hoped for solidarity, from whom I didn't receive it, you know, but those were not that many in number, is the truth, you know. And the great mass of writers and book world people, you know, actually behaved really very well, you know, actually understood that something very serious was happening here, in which they were all implicated, you know, they could all see it wasn't just about me, you know, that this was a moment when, you know, when a line had to be held, but you couldn't concede the fight. It was that what was at stake was too big, you know, that this line had to be defended, you know. And I think one of the great reasons why we managed to defend the book was that very wide belief that it needed to happen, you know. Not because the book was particularly this or that, you know, but for the, you know, for this old reason of the freedom of speech, you know, and that's why so many people that I never met went to bat for me, you know. So booksellers put the book in the window. People working in publishing companies who were receiving threats on the telephone, you know, were not cowed into submission. You know, the book was published everywhere. The book was kept in print. People went and bought it as an act of support and solidarity. You know, ordinary readers, you know, that was their way of saying, I'm on this side. You know, and I think that was that sort of collective act of ordinary people. You know, politicians, as is often the way, came very late to the party. You know, but that defense of the right of, not just the right of writers to write and publishers to publish, but the right of readers to decide what they want to read, and not to have that decision made for them by, you know, a mad old priest in Tehran. That was a lot of the reason why we were able to succeed. You know? And I, looking back at it, you know, I look back at two things. One is the book itself as a book, and the other is the story of what happened to the book. You know, and the story of what happened to the book, I think I feel very proud to have been a part of that resistance. You know, and nowadays I think people are much weaker. You know, and I wonder if such an act of collective solidarity would happen again. You know. Because recently things happen like happened in India recently, where Penguin Books withdrew a major work of scholarship just because a couple of Hindu extremists objected to it. You know, and this is the same Penguin Books that defended the Satanic Verses. You know, so I think we have fallen a long way short of the strength that people collectively showed back in the late 80s and early 90s. I always knew that the book was there to write, you know, and that there was a good story to tell, you know, and that I wanted to be the person to tell it first. I didn't want to give my story to somebody else, you know, because that's what I do for a living. So I always wanted to do it, but I always also knew, for a long time, I felt that I just wasn't ready to do it. I wasn't ready emotionally to do it. I didn't feel that I would be the master of the story. You know, I would still in some way be the subject of the story, too emotionally in the power of the story. And I wanted to wait until I felt that I was the one in charge, you know. And in the end, I just thought I would leave this to instinct, you know, that I was going to write my books. And one day, maybe the voice in my head that tells me what to do will say, maybe it's time to think about doing this. You know? And that's more or less what happened, you know. And I was helped by the fact that I had given my literary archive to Emory University, and they had gone through a mammoth job of sorting it out, you know. So suddenly, instead of all my papers being in a mess, everything was very neatly catalogued. I had the master catalogue, you know, and I could simply say, send me this, 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 and this, and the next day, bam, I would have those documents. So it enormously simplified the work of research I would have had to do, you know, to re-enter that story in order to tell it properly. Because if they hadn't done that for me, I would have had to do that, you know, and I probably would never have done it, which means possibly I would never have felt like writing the book. But because that work had been done, so that it became possible for me to write the book with a kind of minimum of difficulty, then I thought, well, okay, well, if it's now reached that point where I can do it, maybe I should do it. Nobody really, that I know of, ever particularly compares my work to either Conrad or Chekhov, you know. And I mean, there's something interesting about Conrad in that he was a writer who crossed a language frontier, you know, and I've always been interested in writers who did that. I mean, he never wrote in his mother tongue of Polish, and I never wrote in my mother tongue of Urdu. We both found a voice in the English language, you know. So there's always been that, and his stories are adventurous and go into strange worlds, you know, and that was interesting. But it was really more that I felt somehow in those years that I was writing about that there were aspects of both Conrad and Chekhov in that world I found myself in. You know, first of all, Conrad wrote a lot about secret agents and spies and conspiracy and danger and revolution and violence, you know, etc. And I found myself in that kind of a Conradian world a little bit, you know. And Chekhov, I felt particularly, I mean, more in his stories, more in his plays than in his stories. You know, wrote a great deal about isolation, melancholy, a yearning to be somewhere else, you know, and whether it's the Three Sisters or Uncle Vanya or whatever, you know, there's that sense that life is elsewhere, you know, and if only you could be elsewhere, then you could be part of life, except that you can't. And that certainly was how I felt a lot, you know, at that time. And so I thought in some strange way, if the worlds of Joseph Conrad and Anton Chekhov were to be fused, that was where I lived. I mean, that's a kind of very surrealist image, you know, the idea of Conrad and Chekhov becoming the same book, you know. But that was the book I was in. I remember during those years, people would ask me if I would write about it. And I would say I don't know how to write about it because I don't know the ending, you know. And it's true. I mean, at more than one point, I thought that it was quite possible that it would have a terrible ending. And then I would not be the person available to write the book, you know. And in some ways, as bad was the idea that it would not have an ending, that my life would just drag on and on and on and on in this way, with no way out of the trap, no way out of the cage, no resolution, no settlement, and that would have had, I think in the end, would have had a very bad effect on me. It would have, psychologically, would have damaged me a great deal. So there was that possibility. And then the third possibility was that we would, we, meaning my family and I, and friends and publishers and translators, would all come out from under this cloud and be able to, just live in the sunshine again. And by a combination of luck and determination, that's what happened. So yes, I'm telling a story which is in some way the story of a victory. But one of the questions I ask at the end of the book is that really true? Is this the story of a victory or a defeat, or somewhere in the middle? And the answer is that if you're talking about my story, just the story of me and what happened to me, and my family and friends and publishers, etc., then yes, you can see it as a victory, because there was an attempt to suffocate a book and to destroy a writer. And that attempt failed. The book is available now in whatever it is, 45 languages or something, and as in print everywhere in the world. And the author is also available, in several locations of the world, including right now here in Denmark. And the publishers did their job and published. And yes, there were tragedies. There was the Japanese translator of the book was murdered. The Italian translator was seriously attacked and survived. And the Norwegian publisher of the book was shot and miraculously survived. So yes, there were casualties, and there was a lot of fear, and there was a lot of, there was a lot of trouble. But at that local level of our battle on behalf of the Satanic Verses, we didn't do so badly, and we can take pride in that. But if you look at the larger subject of where the world has reached since then, I think it's a much more fearful world. I think even in the world of books, I think publishers, booksellers, maybe even writers are more fearful now to take on material which could lead to them being endangered. Nobody wants to go there again. And so there has been a kind of chilling effect, that the message of the Satanic Verses is don't go anywhere near Islam, and so maybe fortunately there are still writers courageous enough to do so. I haven't read the work of this young boy here in Denmark, but he's clearly he's very young, but he's apparently very talented. I have to read his work, but good for him. But now, and he's facing some dangers as a result, Yahya Hassan. And there are still writers around the world who do take it on. There are still publishers brave enough to publish it. There are still booksellers who are prepared to sell. So it's not a total defeat, but there is fear. There's a lot of fear. And we live in a very fearful world. And so at that level, the level of the story beyond my immediate story, I'm not so sure that it is a victory, But I think what the immediate story shows, I hope, is that if you do keep your nerve, you collectively, all of us, if you keep your nerve and you stand up for what you believe to be right, it is possible to succeed. You do not have to fail. It is possible to succeed. And this was one example in which people did keep their nerve and in the end did succeed. Now, maybe other people would do the same. Yeah, it is much more than entertainment, yes, but it has to be entertainment as well. You know, I don't believe it can just not be entertainment, you know, because I don't know, to speak as a reader, I have a very low boredom threshold. You know, I'm easily bored. And as a writer, I want to make sure I'm not writing books that will easily bore people, you know, because I don't want to be making the thing that would bore me if I was reading it. You know, so that means that element of being attractive to the reader, you know, is important to me. You know, and one of the great questions of literature is, how can you be attractive to the reader when you're writing about unattractive things? You know, I mean, if you're talking about terrorism, monstrosities, you know, terrible actions, you know, of dark moments, we live in quite a dark moment, you know. If you want to write about these things, how can you write about it without creating an atmosphere on the page which people don't want to breathe? You know, people don't want to be there. Or do you have to so much sugarcoat what you're writing about that in some ways you become dishonest about the thing you're writing about because you're making it too attractive? You know, I mean, these are one of the big problems, I think, for literature always has been about how you write about the darkness. I don't know about my duty to challenge those narratives, but it's my inclination. You know, I mean, I think there are as many ways to be a writer as there are writers. You know, there are many very fine writers who don't challenge the status quo, you know, who work within that in order to tell their stories and do so very well. You know, so it's to be challenging and subversive and so on and so on. It's not the only way of being a writer. It just happens to be my way of being a writer. I also have become very wary of overclaiming what literature can be. You know, I mean, it's very tempting for writers to make very grand statements about literature and its place in the world. You know, I think actually books mostly can't do very much. You know, I'm not sure how much responsibility I can take for what the Satanic Verses became in the world, but it certainly didn't become what I meant it to be. You know, so whatever it became, it wasn't by my design. You know, and yet it, you know, it made its kind of noise, but it wasn't the noise I wanted it to make. So writers' agency in terms of how their books function in the world is quite limited. You know? I mean, the number of books which directly affect events in the way that the writer hopes that they will, that's a very small number. You know, I mean, right now, if I think about it, the book that first comes to mind is Uncle Tom's Cabin. You know, but which did have a considerable effect on American readers and what they thought about the slavery question. You know, in the years coming up to the Civil War. But I think books can do a lot, if you like, to reframe the way in which questions can be asked, the way in which the world can be interrogated. You know, the writer can say, I think of it this way. It may not be the way you think of it, I think of it this way. What do you think about the way I think of it? You know, and that's the gamble of literature, in a way, is that the writer sitting in his room will ask that question to the best of his ability and then send it out into the world and hopes that the world has a favorable answer to the question, you know, and that becomes the dialogue between the book and the world. And I mean, I'm interested in that. I'm no control over it, really, but I'm interested in asking those questions. There are clearly two things that you do as a writer. One is what you do inside your writing, and the other is what you do outside your writing. You know, what you do outside your writing has more to do with your sense of your responsibility as a citizen. You know, as a citizen of a of a city or a country or the planet. And again, yes, of course, it's impossible for any individual writer to take up every cause, to fight every battle, and or at least very difficult to do that if you want to actually get on with your own life and work. That takes over. But I mean, I have felt the need to do that quite often because I remember how important it was for me that people stood up for me. I know how much it means to a writer in distress to feel that there is a sense of support and solidarity out there, and so, yeah, I mean, I do it in a very kind of ad hoc way. I mean, when I'm introduced to cases or learn about cases which seem to need highlighting, then I sometimes do try. And I mean, I think sometimes these are very celebrated cases, and sometimes not so much. But I mean, I don't have, if you like, a kind of strategy of it. I just do it when I can.